Good evening, everybody. Good evening. It was a weird start today, but hey, welcome to the Erudition Network interactive Black History session that we do every Thursday. I am your host, Eddie K. Phillips. This again is our interactive history session that we do every Thursday, where we cover Black history that is usually has not been taught, has been hidden, may not has been as much shared. And we answer questions live as we go into this history. I'm going to give a little bit of a moment for people to join us, get inside, get in, and get on, and join in the conversation. The subject tonight is a heavy subject. I initially was not going to, this was not the plan for tonight. I was going to cover another topic entirely, talking about early man and talking about things like that. But the events of the last few days and things that have been going on made me change where I was going to go with the program tonight. Eric, good to see you, brother. I'm happy that you're here. Tonight, I'm going to go into a very deep topic, a topic that people have actually asked me to talk about for quite some time, but I did not feel that I could go into it. I don't think I was prepared to go into it. It's a very touchy subject and one that still impacts us today. And so I'm going to talk about sundown towns tonight. Sundown towns. And I would like to believe, I would really like to believe today, in today's day and age, that sundown towns no longer exist. I would like to have the belief and really be able to tell you that that is the case. But that is not the case. We still live in a country where we are experiencing issues and places where blacks and people of color, let's say that, are told that they cannot live or are encouraged not to live in these places. And I am going to get a little interactive tonight about it. So if you want, I ask you to share this program. It's been, I want participation on here tonight, questions if you have them. But I know I can't unpack the whole thing tonight. So I have to go first, as I think any reputable historian should. I have to first go into what has led us here. What is the genesis of sundown towns? That's one question for you all out there. The second thing that I have to ask is, do you believe sundown towns still exist? Because there are those who do not believe that it exists. There are those who will tell you that those are things that happened decades ago, before the civil rights movement or during the civil rights movement. There are people who will argue that, you know, I don't live in a sundown town. However, I don't have any blacks in my area, and never question the history behind it. I know in my time in the Navy, I met many people who would tell me and would say, Eddie, it was not a lot of black people that lived around us. Or people who would tell me, you are the first intelligent black person I've ever talked to. And I would think that those things were like ludicrous. I'd say to myself, how can somebody say something like that and not understand at its base how bigoted that sounds? But the truth is, a lot of people, they don't know how bigoted it sounds, because it was really their way of life. And it's not a strike against them. It's not saying that they were bad people. It's simply the fact that they were not exposed to African Americans. And they had an idea of who African Americans were because of their exposure, because they weren't exposed. And so tonight, I gave a little bit of time for folks to get in. We're going to talk about that. We are going to talk about that. Give me a moment here. Because here we are right now in this country, still facing issues based on the ignorance perpetuated and in times gone before. If you are fortunate enough to see the advertisement that I put out for the show, you will know that there was an issue that happened recently with a young man named Rasheem Carter. And his body was recovered, deteriorated, beheaded in the woods. More things about that case are coming out day by day. But this is down in Mississippi, and in Arkansas, in Tennessee, in these areas where there is a historic background to this type of dysfunctional behavior. Eric, I'm not sure. I actually don't realize what that means. Jackson, Mississippi doesn't have clean drinking water. Even in your hometown, lead has been found in water. Chicago, are those sundown towns? No, Eric. The history behind a sundown town, or gray towns, as people used to call them, or there was another term they had too. It escapes me. But these are communities in the United States and in some in Canada that have historically excluded or limited the residence or access to residence for people of color, namely African Americans, and actually put up signs that told people you cannot be in the town after dark. And they were created in a many different ways. Some were established by laws and ordinance. They actually put that on the books. Others were created through pressure, through social pressure, through violence, through anger, through murder. And it is a history that is not often talked about. It is different from redlining. Redlining, I tell you, you can't live here. Sundown, you can work here, you can come here, but you can't be here, you cannot stay here. And if you think that you can, then we're going to do violent things to you. We're going to enact things that will make you not want to be in this town. From abuse up until death. And so it is an important thing that we need to remember, right? That we need to remember. And you mentioned Illinois. Illinois was a huge place, a huge example, even in the North. We speak so much about sundown towns as if they're only they were only towns where in the South. And I'm going to get into that tonight. Right? I'm going to get into that tonight because I think that, it's so much, even Eric, and I know you're pretty well read, but a lot of people don't know. They don't know. And so I want us to look at this right now. Why I'm hesitating is because I'm actually grabbing a few images that I did not have. Now, here's the thing about sundown towns. Many of these places, it wasn't just about blacks. Even though blacks got the most of the hate, hurt, and harm, it was just also any people of color. I don't know if I'll get further into that tonight, but I'm going to start this lesson. I gave enough time for those who just didn't know that, didn't realize that we were starting. But I'm going to get into this because I know we need to have this conversation. So as we're talking about this tonight, I'm going to give you all a map. Yeah, we're going to be a little bit interactive tonight. I don't always have images. And again, this was not something that I really thought I was going to cover tonight. So I didn't have a lot of images that I pulled up, but I'm going to pull something up today because I want you all to actually actively see how it is still affecting us. Pull this up for you. All right, here we go. Good evening, Sister Regina. Good to see you. Good to see you. We're just really kind of starting right now. You say, how does Black Wall Street play into this? I'm curious. Well, Black Wall Street does play into it in a certain way, but not so much as it being a sundown town. So I'm going to share this image with you all. I was bringing it up. Share my screen here. This is an interactive map. As we get into this lesson tonight, let's talk about this. This is an interactive map that shows you places that have either historically been named as sundown towns or still enforce what is believed to be sundown practices. You will notice in the area of Illinois that it is heavy. You will see that some of them are actually marked surely. Surely. You will also see in areas close down to Mississippi and in the South that they're not as strong, right? These places aren't as strong and labeled. And there are Black communities, places that we know, but we also know that there are places like Perryville, Arkansas, which may come up a little later. We know that there are places in Illinois historically, in the Skokie area and places like that, that people were told they could not live in. And there are huge areas where blacks can't go, Buckley, Illinois. And you see all of these areas heavily, heavily structured to still not, how do they do it? Not allow blacks to be there. And the police become involved in policing these areas to pull black people over in their cars and as they're walking in the area and asking, why are you here? Sundown towns. So I share this with you because I want you to see how all this works. Yes, Denver too. Denver had a huge Klan contingent. Maybe one day I'll do an episode could go really deep into that. But they had a huge Klan contingent out here in Denver. But Indiana and Illinois, because Indiana used to, and in many ways still is, certain areas of Indiana used to be the hub for the KKK. For the second and modern Klan. I'm going to share some other things with you all real quick. I'm bringing them up right now. A couple of pictures here before we get really into the history of this. And if you have a friend who may be interested in this, hey, send something on Facebook or on social media and tell them, hey, get online tonight. I'm here for your questions as we go through this lesson. All right. So I'm going to present. Sorry, this thing is moving a little slow for me tonight. Everyone, I apologize. I'm going to present something here. See this picture? You may have been watching the news and seeing these things, what's been going on with the case of Rasheem Carter and his body and his remains being found. This was the skull, the picture of the skull that was presented of this young black man that was left of him after his family put out a missing report and they went looking for him. And this is what of several parts that were left of him. He was decapitated. And the police the sheriff in the area saying that there was no wrongdoing done. And this young black man is dead. And to put a face to this, we really have to look at who he was, not what they did or what was done. This was a young black man taken in his prime. And we know this to be the case, that some malfeasance, something bad happened, because the family actually put out a picture that they got from the police that was the last image that is believed to be seen of this young man as he was running in the woods, and he was caught by a trail camera running through the woods after he had informed his mother that he felt he was being followed and that some of the people that he had worked with. Let's give clarity here. This young man took a job in the South because he worked at a place that had went out of business because of COVID. He was working, I believe, in a restaurant down there, and he had run-ins with some whites, as he told his mother, and he thought that they were going to do something to him. And the last image that we have is in October of this young man running through the woods, running from what we don't know. But we know that his body was found, and parts of his body were found scattered in the woods. And here's the reason tonight why I'm going into the topic of sundown towns. Tonight, we're going to cover how do we get here. But it's deeper than just how do we get here. The history of sundown towns is a dark history of our country. It is something that a lot of us were never taught in school because nobody wanted us to know. Nobody wanted to share it. When they told you, stranger, don't let the sun go down on you here. You're not wanted here. Yeah. When they told you, black man, black woman, that this is only a whites only area. Don't be here. That was in Illinois. During the World War II, it was also pushed upon the Japanese, people who were Asian, because they didn't discriminate, because they didn't know what they were. Don't let the sun set on you here. Keep moving. This is Rose Hill. These areas of hate, these areas that we know people were killed in and murdered in, and yet we're not taught about it. Many of us, as Eric got on and say, we know redlining, but we don't really understand gray towns, sundown towns. We don't understand that black people had to come up with the green book to tell people where they could not stay overnight. The African-American Travelers books that told folks, hey, you can stay in this hotel, but you can't stay here. Even though that movie Green Book came out 2018, right? Talking about the Negro Motorist Guide that told you where you could and could not go in lieu of possible death, harm. This book that was printed out for nearly 30 years. 30 years. But that's not a part of our known history. And why is that? Because again, we're living in a society that wants to hide our history. Sean Anthony, it's almost like a horror movie type town where everybody knows to not be out during the night or else horrifying things will happen to you. It is kind of like that. So, Eddie, I found out something interesting. Mississippi didn't legally condemn slavery until 2013. That is absolutely correct. More accurately, Mississippi didn't abolish slavery until 2013. They didn't ratify. That is true. And I've talked about that before. They did not ratify. If you're here tonight, please drop us a line. Let us know that you're here. Let us know that you're here. Let us know that you're watching. Know that you're a part of the conversation. I appreciate it because it lets us know what audience we have and get you interacting. So as I was going through this lesson, I was concerned. I was greatly concerned, I must add, because I didn't want to talk about all of this. And it's not because I'm not a good historian. It's not because I don't believe that we should know it. It's because it hits too close to home. I don't know if I've shared this with you all before, but my grandmother's father, great-grandfather, was killed in the South. He was denied treatment because of though he was a very fair-skinned man, he was denied treatment because of the areas in which he lived and the jealousies of whites. And it's so sad. And as I learned this history about my family, it upset me so much because, again, this is what we're still fighting with and living with. We're still living and fighting this. And many of us are not aware. Many of us don't know. So I took great concern and covering this and saying to myself, Eddie, do you want to cover this? Do you really want to go into this? So if I seem a little bit hesitant tonight, it's because, sundown towns rose right after the Civil War. During that crucial period, historians call it the Nadir. Some call it post-Reconstruction. From 1890 to 1940, this country went through a huge, horrible civil rights problem with blacks predominantly. But as we're going to cover tonight, it wasn't just blacks. It never is just us, right? It's never just us. What really happened is that we had a place in this country where we were no longer property. See, property has value. Property has value. You wouldn't let somebody go out and destroy your car. You wouldn't let somebody go out and destroy your house. Property has value. And blacks had value back then. You were valuable, or your ancestors had value because they were something that was used to trade off of. They were people who they gave authority and rank and privilege to whites. And so they felt in their minds that they had to protect their property. I've said many times that in a lot of the slave narratives, you will read how slaves used the master to protect them from other masters, right? A master would say, you can't put your hands on my slave. And so they would go run. They would go see the woman that the slave marriages that they had, which weren't legal standing, and they would go over to another plantation and they would be with the woman and then they'd run back. But if you go and you look, after the Civil War, the country was different. You were no longer property. You said what? Looking briefly, this wasn't restricted to Southern town. This is actually were northern cities as well. Yes, and we're going to get into that, Eric. We're going to get into that. May not get it all tonight, but we're going to get into it. See, what happened was many towns and counties in the north, right? They were not seen as racist after the Civil War. Why? Because a lot of the times, the Civil War veterans who had fought for the Union, right? They actually often went and bought free blacks into the town. We have an example of a man named Reverend James Rogers, right, from Wisconsin. He was a chaplain for the 14th Wisconsin Volunteers. And when he got out of after the Civil War, right, he was reassigned to Cairo, Illinois. And what he did was he brought in hundreds of freed African Americans, dispossessed, who didn't have any place to go. And he brought them into Cairo, Illinois by the hundreds. And they used these people to help found large parts of Cairo, of that city. These are former slaves who were welcomed by whites who had played a part in the Civil War. Most of them of that time were called Republicans, right? The party of Lincoln. And so they allowed them to come in. And it was anti-racist behavior. Blacks felt like our ancestors felt like they finally had a place as these veterans welcomed them and they could leave the South. You know, before the war, the Democratic Party, which at the time was a very racist party, they overtly called themselves the white man's party. And so as the Republicans took over post the Civil War and the death of Lincoln, right, the Democrats labeled the Republicans as the party of look at that, the word always gets me. Miscegenation. You miscegenated. Intermixing. And so there was already a line being drawn after the Civil War, before the Archibald mentalities, for the Archibald Dunning teaching, the revisions, right, had already started. The fear of the black man and woman intermingling with whites sexually has always been an issue. And it was an issue right after right after the Civil War. And as everything was going on, right, the Democrats during the war had blamed, even though people are taught in school now it's all about states' rights, they blamed the Negro for the conflict. They blamed black people who were subject to be property for their problems, for the destruction of the country. And there were Democratic towns that gave refuge to blacks in the North. And they tried to give blacks a chance. When you look at that map and you see the heavy contingent of people in Illinois and in Indiana, and I can't state that enough, when you look at that map and you see Illinois and Indiana heavily congested with their history of sundown towns, it happened for a reason. It happened for a reason. Because what happened was, as blacks came there thinking that it was going to be okay, as Reconstruction failed, they were expelled, pushed out violently. I wrote down a report today as I was preparing for this real quickly. In Chesterton, Indiana, near Lake Michigan, they drove out hundreds of African Americans in 1863. And in that same year, a mob of about 25 men led a riot at Ada, Illinois. This is in the North during the Civil War. The doctor forced 40 African American Civil War refugees who had been working as farm helpers and farm workers, made them flee. There was still racial hate even in the Democratic areas. But we're not taught this. We're not taught this. Illinois is full. Mason County, LaSalle, full of histories of violent actions against blacks, both during and after the Civil War. One of my my favorite black historians, Lerone Bennett Jr., who passed away within the last recent years, when he was asked about Reconstruction around that time, he called it the first and in many ways the last real attempt to establish racial democracy in America. He constantly said it was the one time that America stood up for African Americans, for blacks, and said you had a right. You had a place here. But what is never really covered was the expulsions, the violent expulsions, and the areas where blacks were restricted in going to. And the genesis of it in the South that fed into the North. When Southerners wanted blacks to be there, Northerners became erratic. And why? That's the question. I'm going to ask that question to you all to get you to interact. Why do you think that we saw more sundown towns in the North than we saw in the South? Somebody type that in there. Give me what you think, why you believe that to be. Real quick, just any thought that you got. I will tell you, you say those explosions still happen today. Look at Washington, D.C. Sean Anthony said because the black people had moved from South to the North. That's one theory, though. Okay. Good thought. Good thought. Here's the thing. If you look at the period from 1865 to 1890, toward the end of the period of Reconstruction, African Americans were gaining rights. And I know a lot of people don't like that term African American, but your ancestors come from Africa. It angers people, but know your history. African Americans, they could vote. They served in Congress. They could work as firemen, as carpenters, as barbers, because they were already doing these jobs during slavery. Midwives, mail carriers, milkman, farmers. They were doing all of this. And they were optimistic. They were optimistic. Writers would say, we're on the move. We rising up. We a people. It was the time that I often tell my sons, they thought it as a time of jubilee. They saw it as a time of jubilee. Yet, here we are. And how did we get here? Because even though coming in Reconstruction, things seem good. I see a lot of you guys making comments now. Yes, I did, Eric. I did watch The Woman King. It's good. I have to look into that. Because while they may have fought alongside you in the Civil War, they still didn't want your communion. Or they didn't see, I see what you're saying. They didn't see you as equal. You're absolutely correct. Gina, I thought it was the same as Sean. Blacks moved to the North. So we did have a time of Black migration. This is before the migration. It's really called the fusion period. And it happened between around 1875 to 1890. Because around this time, coming out of the Civil War, going into Reconstruction, people who were racist felt deprived of their property. And they got violent. We had the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, the first Klan. We saw Democrats fighting Republicans on how they would allow blacks to vote. We have record and history of white Democrats killing. We know in Louisiana, I think I said it during one of the broadcasts when I talked about lynching, in Louisiana, in the summer and fall of 1868, white Democrats killed more than 1,000 people, not just blacks. Even though they mostly were African American, they also killed white Republicans who were trying to help blacks. It is one of the reasons why President Grant had to send troops down to the South. They wanted their property back. And if they couldn't have it, then nobody was going to have it. And then when they realized that they could not maintain power, the Republicans, who they were, right, got outsmarted. Because what the Democrats did is they set up what is called fusion tickets. Has anybody ever heard the name fusion tickets? Have you ever heard about fusion tickets or campaigns, fusion campaigns? Does that sound familiar to any of you? Why they don't come to the aid? There's history behind all of that. Teddy said, not at all. A fusion ticket, ladies and gentlemen, was something that racist Democrats did. They realized that they could not get power. So what they did is they created these things called fusion tickets, where they bought in blacks. We still see it done here today with some blacks who some people will call sellouts and whatever. You call them whatever you want to call them, but who compromised themselves because they were given better property, they were given money or whatever. And these fusion tickets happened with the little white movements and things like that of the late 1800s, early 1900s, where the white racist Democrats would run on tickets where they would take the position of governor or senator or congressman. And they would run on tickets that were heavily black with undercard, where the blacks could run for sheriff or some minor office so that they could seem to be inclusive. Because the Democrats were not sure they could keep control of the South, but they did not want to get completely shut out of government. So they compromised. Just as you watch toward the end of the Civil War, the Confederacy compromised by trying to allow blacks to fight for the Confederacy. But you're not really taught about that in history. They compromised and said, well, let's give them a little bit of something where they could be subservient, but not enough where they can dictate and choose our laws. And you see that even today. Reconstruction was so short. It was so short because the Republicans got themselves into positions of power in places. The Democrats. And they manipulated the system, but they could not have done it alone. I think Teddy said it earlier. He said it earlier, because they might have fought for you alongside you, doesn't mean they wanted to commune or live with you. They're God-fearing, I can't have you as a slave, but it does not mean you are equal to me. That played a part. And so when we look at this period, and I'm giving you this history as we lead into these sundown towns, because by 1890, by the end of the Reconstruction era, the federal government got tired of helping blacks. Realizing that the Democrats were manipulating with these fusion tickets, a great Republican senator who's still lauded today and family is still lauded, Henry Cabot Lodge, which you may have read and heard about or remember a little bit in your history books. He introduced one of the first federal election bills to stop the violence and the fraud in Southern elections. And it lost by one vote. One vote. It lost. And In the campaign to push this legislation, Democrats went crazy and called the Republicans nigger lovers. That's what they called them. That was the term. But unlike before with President Grant, where they went in and they called martial law and they stood up for the freemen, the Republicans, the party of Lincoln, pulled back. They backed away. They stopped fighting for the idea of Reconstruction. One of the historians, Professor Lowen, I read one of his books years ago, and he gave 3 reasons why he believed that Republicans stopped fighting for Black people toward the end of the Civil War. And what is a major reason why we have these sundown towns. His statement was that there were 3 eyes, 3 indicators, 3 things that happened that made whites from both parties see Blacks as something flawed or failed. You have to realize that by the time of 1890, because of the death toll of the Civil War, only 1 American in 3 by 1890 was old enough to have been alive when the Civil War ended. And many of the people who were alive had no great, wondrous memory of the Civil War. And so educators like Archibald Dunning manipulated and taught a revisionist history. We also have to look at around that time something that we often talk about in our history books, but do not understand the implications of it, is that millions of people immigrated to the United States after the Civil War. And so even though we know that these eyes played a part in things, they didn't directly impact it. They just influenced. One of the first eyes is the Indian Wars. You know, those wars you all read about in history, and they told you about in history class, right? They told you about all of the things that the fight that the cavalry had on the plains. They told you about how all of this stuff was their way of manifest destiny moving forward. And even though they had guaranteed the Indians their right to have certain places, the America post-Civil War went out of its way here in Colorado and the Dakotas, Wyoming, went out of its way to remove Indians from the land. Even used Black soldiers to go out and help them to do it. And by the time we get to the incident at Wounded Knee in South Dakota, it had already been decided that it was okay to violently, even with murder, to take the Indians' land. And if I can take the land from the red man, as they saw it, what makes it wrong for me to take it from the Black man? What makes it wrong for me to deny him rights? This is long after Columbus, Eric. They decided after the Civil War, we're going to take this land, even the lands that we've made treaties with. Former Union soldiers like Custer, who decided they were going to go in and kill and mutilate, scalp and dishonor these people. That was going on in the West. That's what you saw for the expansion. And that messed with the minds, because this is a policy that is not just decided by racist Democrats of the time. It's also decided by Republicans who had stood up for the right for people to live a certain way and did nothing to stop the tragedies that were put on the indigenous people of this country. A second of the eyes that Dr. Lowen talks about is immigration. The racism behind immigration. When the Irish and the Italians and the Polish came over, and many were forced to go fight during the time of the Civil War as a way to gain citizenship. The draft riots in New York happened because of the anger that the Irish had and being forced to fight for blacks. Thousands of blacks died because of that anger. And Republicans had no love for immigrants, just as the Democrats didn't. This whole America first, America idea, we are true Americans. The reason why we call people African American, Italian American, Irish American comes from these times. Comes from these times. And that's so unfortunate. This is why I think people get mad when we say African American. But here's the thing. I think you should know where you come from. They meant it for our bad, but it is something that I think we need. Americans at that time, the Irish, the Italian, the Polish, realized that the only way for them to be accepted is they had to be accepted as white. There had to be a differentiation right there. There had to be something that identified. Teddy, just look at the Mount Rushmore National Memorial. Yeah, placing your face on Indian land to mark it. Tyson, I just got here, not sure the conversation, but I heard Sundown Towns. I did a commander's advance party. They had posters of kids and KKK. These battalions couldn't leave the base. Oh, wow. We'd been told racism doesn't exist by a good friend on it. Yeah, that's true. Let me tell you something. There's a reason why we say crabs in the barrel. Ladies and gentlemen, we may go over a little bit tonight. So if you have something you have to do at the end of the hour, may do 30 more minutes because I need to get to some of these things before next week. If not, just watch it later. That's all you have to do. But let's think about something here. That crabs in the barrel, the idea that I need to be differentiated from white. I have to have a marker here that allows me to be considered an American. That's important as we start getting into the idea of the sundown town. Yeah, I may be Irish or Italian or Polish, but I'm white like you. And so we started to see things going on in these parties where they were attacking people of color, the Chinese, the black, the indigenous, the American Indian. They just, all of this stuff was going on. And so it could not be done without the participation of other people. When you think that parties and politics play into this, No. What was done could never have been done without help, without people agreeing that the Chinese must go, that black people shouldn't be here, that the Indians don't have rights to the land that they've held for thousands of years. Pushing immigrants to fight with African Americans for petty jobs that just 15 years ago blacks were doing because they were enslaved, and causing fights and brawls, pushing laws on blacks post-Civil War that made them seem to be criminals by nature because they had nowhere to go, pushing out loitering laws. That second I is important because immigrants played a part. People who just got here, who then started to make jokes and slurs and to say things about blacks because they wanted that crab in a barrel mentality. And I have to be better, as the old saying goes, well, at least you are not a N-word. That anti-immigration thinking pushed people to do violent things. We saw that in the draft riots. But it also was pressure put down from the top. Senator Lodge, who had just went out and pushed laws years before, trying to fight for the right to vote for blacks in 1890, he helped found the Immigration Restriction League to keep out inferior racial strains, as was their tenet. So how can your party say that they are for righteousness and for civil rights and liberty, and they're pushing at other folks who come over here who are impoverished? And if I can do that to people who look closer to me, why shouldn't I not do it to the blacks? The third I that Dr. Lowen talks about, imperialism. The idea that we own and we take whatever we want. The annexation of Hawaii, winning the Spanish-American War. These are things that happened that dictated the idea that imperialism was the way to go. We should own this continent. And we will use whatever ways that we can, and many times use blacks to push this. When we look at Hawaii, when we look at Puerto Rico, when we look at Cuba, when we look at the Philippines, when we look at Nicaragua, when we look at Haiti, when we look at the Dominican Republic, when we look at the Virgin Islands, look at the Caribbean, we see all of this stuff that was done post 1890 to establish America as an imperialistic nation that would own post-slavery. How can you look down and say that these countries, these people can deserve us to be over them because they're inferior, and at the same time defend African Americans? How can you vote for legislation, rather you're Republican or Democrat, and then say that you can't lodge your position over blacks? How can you be the fighter for freed blacks when you have a policy in America where you say these people cannot self-govern? So the Hawaiians and the Filipinos and the Haitians, they can't self-govern. We have to be over them. Then how can you not have that same mentality for blacks? Imperialism was war, but it was also financial. During this time, we had gone into the early 1900s, we went into the Gilded Age. You know, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies. And all of these men, they got great wealth off of poor people. And that wealth was used to lobby and get politicians into office who agreed with them. And it's stratified. Stratification means levels. It stratified this country. The first sergeant and I were laughing when they wouldn't serve me. We knew what was up. It took an hour before the white officer noticed and passed me that beer and ordered another. It's still going on, my brother. Yes, so we must defeat the evil Russia. Manifest destiny. Yes. Monroe Doctrine. China to expand our imperialistic ways. Oops, I mean, art for freedom. And we could call it whatever, but it's still imperialism. And we still do it today. We push America. We talk about finance. We talk about wars on different levels. But never with the idea that all men are created equal. But we even termed it. They even the academics even came up with a term for it. They call it social Darwinism. Social Darwinism was such a belief in America and even in Europe that it is one of the things that Hitler believed. The fittest rise to the top in society. Survival of the fittest. And it created the Anglo-Saxon mentality. It created the white supremacy mentality. The Klan, the alt-right, the skinhead. You can give it whatever name you want. But it's racial superiority. The idea that we are the strongest, so we rise to the top. And the deepening of this racism, this social Darwinism, as they named it, are what the eyes that Dr. Lauren was talking about. The subjugation of the indigenous people was the start. It was the beginning. But it wasn't the end. The immigrants coming over and wanting to be treated as whites and put into positions to fight against blacks. Indigenous, immigrant, and then imperialism. All these things were things to push. And I have to cover this before we ever get into the idea of sundown towns. We got to know why. Politicians agreed. We could call it ethnocentrism, but what does it come from? That's the term. Why did they believe this? Why did they believe this? Why did the Nader happen? The Nader was a cultural movement. And it came because of the decay, the desire to no longer force or fight for Civil War idealism. The desire to give up. Because as my son so eloquently said earlier, right? They did, even though, how did Teddy say it? Because while they might fought alongside you, they didn't want to commune with you. They didn't want to see you as equal. And even though an individual like, say, a Lincoln, toward the end of his life, who understood that this war had been about Black people, Black lives, the sin of slavery, Even when you had a president like Ulysses S. Grant, who sent federal troops down to protect blacks during Reconstruction. But after him, his successors were not as fair. If the radical Republicans had passed more election bill laws and they'd fought harder, if President McKinley hadn't decided that he was going to go and wage war in the Philippines and open up the door for imperialism that was later fed by people like Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, maybe we wouldn't have had the situation. If affluency, richness wasn't something that we idolized and was able to penetrate government and choose people who had no care for Black lives. This is what happened. And when people like Archibald Dunning wrote books where they basically said Blacks were enslaved people, and the only reason why they were enslaved is because they were inferior. They were inferior. That's social Darwinism. Because, see, slavery, though freed from it, it stigmatized Blacks. And it told people that our ancestors were not worthy. Because had they been worthy, how could they have ever been enslaved? Without slavery, we would not have the understanding or the need or the desire that whites had for segregation. The Supreme Court Justice William Douglas, I think I said this in an episode a couple of months ago. He said that slavery is unwilling to die. It's just another name for it. He said this in 1968. Because the mentality, though the legal stripping of slavery was gone, the mentality never died. When you have a party calling themselves the white man's party, the Lily White Party, you start to understand that this is something that is deeply rooted in America. So that by the time you get to 1894, Democrats, now in power, stripped the power of the 15th Amendment and basically made it lifeless. And by the time we got down to 1896, with the verdict of Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal, you had everything you needed for segregation. But while we look at Plessy versus Ferguson of 1896, many of us don't remember in 1898, the riots in Wilmington, North Carolina, where they drove out the mayor and all the Republican office holders and killed 12 African Americans, 12 Blacks. And that the president at the time, McKinley, who had been asked to step in and help, did nothing. And he allowed it to happen without anyone being charged. As they slowly pulled out Blacks who had been elected into the legislature, congressmen, and they disenfranchised us. People don't realize that no African American, no Black served in Congress in any capacity until 1929, and that no Black served from any areas of the South until at least 1973, the year I was born. So whether they were people who were still alive, who had been Confederates, or they were neo-Confederates, or they were just people who sympathizers. They were happy. They were happy. Because they understood that they were getting their way. How much time we got? We're 10 minutes in. We got a little bit more time. I'm going to go on for another 20 minutes. You may ask yourself, if you're watching the program tonight, Eddie, why are we covering all of these before we actually talk about these sundown towns? As this map I showed you. You may ask. But I can't get into sundown towns and the unfortunate issues that are happening today and what happened to this young man in the South. I can't get into that without laying down for you historically what has been going on, who we are. The issues with Rasheed Carter, the issues with lynching in this country, they didn't just happen. There's a buildup that is not covered in your history books. The idea that the black man is not equal to the white man didn't just happen. When new laws were passed, lynching rose. When Plessy versus Ferguson was passed, lynching rose. Because they no longer had to see us as equal. Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, spoke completely and said, post-Civil War, the Negro is not equal to the white man. And then the Democrats won office and pushed that as law. And even though we say, well, it took them a long time to establish a lynching law, let's remember that whites were lynched too. They were lynched too and called out of their names and said to be lovers of people. Eric, you can ask your question. We talk about the Jim Crow South, but we don't really understand what people really had to go through. They teach our kids about the progressive era, but don't let them understand that the progressive era was for whites only. And that those progressive era, you know, those legislations, the 5-day work week and things like that, that wasn't done for blacks. And we don't remember how many blacks were moved in northern cities out of good jobs that families had had since the end of the Civil War that were stripped from them. Those skills that they had gained. They couldn't be carpenters. They couldn't be firemen. They were pushed out. They were allowed, because of Plessy versus Ferguson, to say you couldn't work here, that you couldn't be in this restaurant, that you couldn't live in this hotel, that you could not be a part of normal life. That's what happened. And that wasn't just one party that did it. They are all over the country, Eric. They're all over the country, and they're still very, very active. They did. And they did generis, and they did it under the guise of progressive. You still hear liberals today talk about the progressive era and leave out the historical marker that a lot of the progressive era legislation was racist on its face. See, because before all of those laws and things that were agreed upon, they could work. They could be in factories. They could be postal workers. They could do all of that. Hell, they were even in sports. You know, we give Jackie Robinson the credit for integration, but we forget that African Americans, blacks, played in the major leagues in the 1880s. And that they were forced out. We forget that they served in some parts of the military. They were a part of life. By 1889, they had forced people out of these little minor leagues and baseball leagues as they came up. They didn't want blacks a part of it, not because they couldn't play, but because they could play too well. And it went through all sports. We look at at baseball, but you look at boxing. What happened to Jack Johnson when he beat Jim Jeffries, the Great White Hope? This argument, this hate started, and it grew through education, through social conditioning. Article after articles. Chicago Defender at the time wrote articles weekly in Chicago, in Illinois, about the denial of African Americans, them being denied jobs and abilities. And so, as Eric is asking on here, though you see some Arizona and some Georgia, some Mississippi, you see a huge conglomeration of sundown towns in the north. And why is that? Because though segregation was the law of the land in the South, separate but equal, they didn't push blacks out. They wanted blacks there. They created opportunities for African Americans to work in the South as life had existed before the Civil War. And they paid them a little bit of wage. They had people to go in and and work as maids in their homes. Young boys to go clean their yards, grown men to clean their yards, cook their food, drive their taxis. So they had no problem in blacks working as long as they took a subordinate role. So as long as they could steal, they didn't raise their heads to the white man. But not in the North. In the North, they told you, you're not allowed here. Don't come here. When the sun goes down, you get out of here. And it became violent. It became violent. I got about 10 more minutes left. And I tried to unpack a lot here. They invented the pipe dust nicknamed Monkey Wrench. There is a new green, not necessarily a green book, Tyson, but there definitely is an issue with sundown towns. And we need to be aware of it. We need to be aware of it. The last thing we'll talk about is the thing that happened. And it happened in Arkansas. And I bring this up because I believe this is where they found this young man's body. Harrison, Arkansas was a place post-Civil War. It was an interracial town by the end of the Reconstruction era. The town had Black people in it. It had whites, and they adopted a separate but equal mentality, but they lived there with each other. And though there was never really a large population, there were a significant amount of Blacks who lived in Harrison, Arkansas. However, though the Blacks and the whites in Harrison, Arkansas got along together, so much to the point where whites actually patronized and went to Black businesses and bought things in the Black community. They were separate. They had different schools and they stayed separate, but there was still interaction. And even though it was wrong at the end of Reconstruction, where the federal government paid for one of the schools in Harrison, Arkansas, and Blacks had to raise money, but the whites in the city, they are in the community, they actually helped to raise money to build a Black school. So it wasn't a hateful place coming towards the end of Reconstruction. But as thought processes changed, as people like Archibald Dunning's ideas, as Woodrow Wilson's racist ideas, things changed. A Democrat, a racist Democrat named Jeff Davis, not Jefferson Davis from the Confederacy, he ran for office, and he successfully ran for governor in 1900, 1902, and 1904. But when he got to the United States Senate in 1906, his campaign became very, very anti-Black. And one of the things he is quoted as saying in one of his speeches is that we have come to a parting of the ways with the Blacks. He called us criminals. He called us heretical, lustful, and warned about our ancestors laying hands on their daughters and their wives. And if you remember around this time also, the country was starting to get to the idea of income tax. And bankruptcy in the country was up high. Two major railroads, the Missouri and North Arkansas Railroad, they had failed. So people were out of work and they were angry and they needed somebody to blame. So unfortunately, they took an example. One night, in September 30th in 1905, a Black man who was labeled in newspaper articles as Dan reportedly just came to take shelter. He was cold and he was a vagrant. And he was arrested for breaking into someone's home on a cold night, cold, rainy night. And he was jailed with another criminal who, at the time, another vagrant, who they call Rabbit. And what happened was a white mob, people who had gotten along with Blacks, stormed the building, took these two Black men from jail, and whipped them openly in the street. And that would have been bad enough. But their anger and their jealousy of not having money, the white rioters went crazy. And they went to the few, not so large community, Black community, the people who they had gone and bought from their stores. They swept through these Black neighborhoods. They burned down stores. They destroyed things, armed with guns and clubs. And they pulled men and women out of their homes, tied them to trees, and beat them. Then they tied their hands up, took them out to a field in the woods, and threw them in a 4-foot hole near Crooked Creek. And though we don't know how many were actually killed, we know that there was something told to them that night. They told all of the blacks there, this was no longer a town for you. You need to flee. Get out of here. So black people took their entire families and they left because the whites told them no nigger had better be left there after the sun goes down. This is a historical fact. Now, there were still blacks who were there because wealthy families didn't want to lose their servants. And so they allowed them and they hid them and they stayed on their grounds, on their land, until 1909. Until after more failure, after more financial failure, they had charged an African-American man with armed robbery and also said he possibly raped someone. And the mob went out again and started to attack the few blacks that were left. And blacks fled out of Harrison, Arkansas, fearing for their lives. That was in 1905. And in 1909. Do you know that Harrison remained a sundown town on record until 2002? Still restricted. So when you see this map that I've left displayed up next to me, I want you to understand what we're talking about. This is just the first episode, and I think I covered a lot tonight. And I gave you an extra 30 minutes because I thought it was so important because of the loss of that young man. Because the failure for us to understand that we do not live in a world where people aren't still acting this way. And so as I log off tonight, as I finish this session, I want you to think about this. I want you to think about this young man. I want you to consider this loss of life. It didn't need to happen. Rasheem Carter was running through the woods, running for his life. No shirt on and scared. That's a fact. That's just this last October. This young man. And the only thing that was left of that young man, as they're looking out right now, is his remains. After he said whites had told him they didn't want him there. After he had run into racial intolerance. And here we are right now. Here's what this was left for him, for his family. Sundown towns were and are real. I say it again, were and are real. And they didn't happen just because one party was racist. They happened because people decided there was no benefit in defending Black life. That's the takeaway I want for you tonight. We were attacked and we still are. And lies have been told because remember, the sheriff in this case said that there was no act, there's no criminal act here for a young man who was decapitated. That's what we're living. That's what we're dealing with today. Tyson, I didn't see your comment. Is at any organization that is keeping track of statistics that could create a new. Yes, there are many people who the actual interactive map that I shared with you all tonight is actually from a group. You could get on and go look up Sundown Town history, and you will probably see this group pop up talking about history of justice. James Lowen, who passed away in 2021, wrote many books and talked about it for years. He's a great source. Professor Lowen is a great source to go to and read about some of these things. Somebody that you definitely can look up. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I've been on here an extra 30 minutes. I thank all of you all who stuck with us. This is a very heavy subject and one that needs to be talked about. Wasn't planning to talk about it, and I think I went over it in general, but I definitely wanted you all to get something from it tonight. I hope that you did. Please support the Erudition Network. My sons are on Wednesday evenings. I think everybody's going to shift to 5 o'clock now. So you may see the one at 5 o'clock. There'll be things out that'll go out. They'll talk about that. I will be back on Saturday night. Late Saturday night, I do the Erudition Network wrap up. I did not do it this last week because people didn't let me know that if it was something that they needed. If you need a refresher or you have other questions that you didn't get to ask tonight about any of the subjects that my wife or my son, my wife's who show us on Monday, that they covered, that's the time to come back, especially if you can't watch any of the live sessions. We will definitely be on at 7 o'clock Central Time, 6 o'clock Mountain Time. We'll get on and we'll talk a little bit on Saturday nights and give you an opportunity to refresh and wrap up what's going on. All right. Thank you, Jadaris. I hope that I'm glad you got something from it. I will see you all next week. Well, I'll see you all Saturday, those who tune into the wrap up. But until then, I'll see you next Thursday. We'll go into another deeper dive into Sundown Towns and come out of the Reconstruction area as we come into the early 1900s, and we'll talk about the history and the failures that got us to a point where we are right now, and while we're still seeing lynchings and murders in areas and Black people being told to go back home, go back where you came from, and going through these issues that have not gone away. All right. I belabored you enough. You all have a wonderful rest of your evening, and thank you again. Please share, like, ring the bell, share it with friends. I think this is a very important thing to talk about, and hopefully they can get something too. Don't just covet the information yourself. Share it with everybody. Until then, ladies and gentlemen, thank you again. Bye.